Some time ago, a woman came to see me. She said she'd been the quiet one in her family for as long as she could remember. Her husband, her children, even her closest friends, they knew her as kind, gentle, dependable. But they didn't know her thoughts. Not really. She hadn't realized it, but her silence had become a wall. She thought it protected others, but in truth, it kept her own heart locked away. Every disagreement, every fear, every small frustration she swallowed. She was 52, and yet she felt like a stranger in her own life. Her marriage had grown routine, her children independent, and she invisible even to herself. She told me quietly, almost apologetically, "I just don't know how to speak up without causing trouble." As I listened, I noticed how her eyes carried both regret and a deep longing. She wanted peace, yes, but she also wanted to be seen. Perhaps this speaks to someone listening, wondering if their own quietness has been a choice or a habit that has cost more than they realized. She began to settle into the chair, and I opened my Bible, letting the quiet fill the room for a moment. Sometimes the stillness is what allows a story to emerge. As I looked at her, I thought about how often women carry so much in silence, habits formed over decades, a carefulness meant to preserve peace, yet quietly shaping their own hearts. As I prayed with her, I saw the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her shoulders softened, the slight catch in her voice when she dared to name what had been buried. It reminded me that even small steps toward clarity can ripple outward, touching more than we realize. Perhaps this is why I continue to share these reflections here, as a space where women who have walked long seasons of responsibility and faith can pause, notice, and consider their own hearts. If you find yourself here, listening quietly, perhaps you might take a moment to breathe in that same grace. If this resonates with you, I warmly invite you to join our circle. You might leave a comment with your city or state. It's always meaningful to know who is journeying alongside us. And if a story touches your own experience, feel free to share it with someone you trust. Sometimes just naming what we feel is the first step toward gentle transformation. May this space be one where reflection is welcome, voices are honored, and hearts are encouraged to move toward clarity and peace. When she arrived, she moved slowly, almost as if she were carrying something invisible on her shoulders. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, fingers entwined, yet there was a subtle tension around them, a quiet alertness like a coiled spring. She greeted me softly, barely above a whisper, and for a moment I noticed how carefully she measured each word. "Some days I feel invisible," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. Then she paused, as if even that admission was risky. There was more she wanted to say, I could tell, but she held it back. Her lips pressed together, and her eyes flicked toward the window. In that silence, the weight of years of restraint settled into the room. I noticed her posture, upright, disciplined, yet rigid. It was as if she had learned to stand still so the world wouldn't see the cracks beneath. She spoke of her family in practical terms: schedules, meals, responsibilities. She mentioned little about herself. And that, I realized, was the pattern. Her own needs, her own thoughts, her own voice had been carefully edited out of daily life for decades. Her story emerged in fragments. She hadn't realized that by always deferring, always smoothing over, she had created a quiet barrier around herself. Others saw kindness, patience, diligence, and they appreciated it. But she, the one living it, had become a spectator in her own story. She didn't claim space, she didn't ask for acknowledgement, she didn't speak her heart. As I watched her, I could see the invisible thread that tied her patterns together, a sense of responsibility that had grown into self-erasure. And yet, beneath that careful restraint, there was a subtle yearning for recognition, for clarity, for a place where her voice could exist without fear. She hadn't said it aloud, but it shimmered in her stillness, in the slight tremor of her fingers, in the careful pause before each sentence. Even in that first meeting, it was clear she had carried this habit for years, and that acknowledging it might be the first step toward finding her own voice again. When she left my office that first day, she returned to a home that looked ordinary to anyone passing by. Morning light spilled across the kitchen counters, coffee brewing in its usual rhythm, children moving through the house with the easy energy of routine. She prepared breakfast with meticulous care, measuring portions, timing the toaster, wiping down counters before anyone else had even stirred. Everything about her day seemed structured, a well-oiled routine designed to keep chaos at bay. Yet beneath the surface, a different rhythm pulsed quietly. Her choleric temperament, decisive, fiery, quick to notice imbalance, often went unseen because she channeled it into silent work. If someone spoke sharply to her, even in passing, she didn't argue. She said nothing, swallowed the sting, and kept moving. She had learned early that voicing disapproval might disrupt the calm she had built, and so her reactions became a kind of autopilot. Every unspoken frustration, every swallowed disagreement, was stored carefully, like a ledger that nobody ever checked. By mid-afternoon, subtle triggers appeared. A husband's absent-minded comment, a child's careless tone, a minor household inconvenience. These were enough to stir her underlying tension. But instead of confrontation, she retreated inward. She straightened a pillow, reorganized a bookshelf, or washed dishes yet again. Small movements, concrete actions, that masked the undercurrent of unspoken emotion. The house remained orderly. She remained composed. But her interior life carried a quiet storm of withheld words and deferred needs. Evenings were the same. She would settle into her favorite chair, Bible in hand, and reread familiar passages, not seeking dramatic insight, but a steadying presence. Her silent prayers often circled the same themes: peace, clarity, patience. She was aware of her patterns, even if she hadn't named them fully. And yet, the choleric fire beneath her quiet exterior made her intensely aware of injustices she wouldn't mention. A critical remark from her spouse, a subtle insult from a friend, the slow erosion of her own priorities. Her internal compass recognized wrongs that never reached the surface. It was a pattern many viewers might recognize. Decades of emotional self-control, cultivated to maintain harmony, yet leaving a subtle emptiness. American marriage silence and Christian emotional struggle 50+ are more than hashtags. They are lived realities. Her days were full, productive, responsible, but the cost was a constant editing of her own voice. She was a woman committed to care, yet the care often excluded herself. Even in these quiet routines, she longed for small acknowledgement, a glance that recognized her effort, a voice that noticed her interior life. And perhaps that longing, more than the small irritations or daily challenges, was what made her story deeply human. The tension between responsibility and suppressed voice was not dramatic, but it was persistent. A familiar rhythm to any woman who has spent decades preserving peace while quietly wanting to be seen. Over the weeks, her visits began to peel back layers she hadn't allowed herself to notice before. The core tension became clearer, a wound that had been quietly shaping her life for decades. She had spent years believing that staying silent was a form of kindness, that withholding her opinions, avoiding disagreement, and smoothing over tensions was a gift to everyone else. But in truth, that silence had a cost. She began to speak of moments that felt small on the surface, but carried deep resonance. A forgotten birthday, a subtle dismissal from her spouse, a friend's casual disregard. These were not dramatic events, but they formed a mosaic of unacknowledged pain. Each slight, real though seemingly minor, had accumulated over time. And she had avoided feeling it fully because facing it meant confronting her own complicity. The years she had permitted her needs to be secondary, the words she had swallowed, the moments she had let pass without asserting herself. The consequence of this avoidance had woven itself into her daily life. She described evenings where she would collapse into her chair, exhausted, feeling a quiet emptiness that no routine, no prayer, no Bible passage could fully soothe. She realized she had been carrying a dual burden: responsibility for her household and responsibility for her own emotional restraint. Her energy, her joy, her sense of self-worth, all had been siphoned into maintaining appearances, keeping the peace, and preserving harmony at any cost. "I just feel stuck," she admitted one afternoon, voice trembling slightly. "I've lived so long trying not to cause trouble that I don't know how to live for myself anymore." The words were simple, yet they held decades of accumulated restraint. She had avoided confronting the question that had quietly haunted her. What would it mean to speak, to assert, to honor her own inner life without guilt? Even in her silence, her choleric temperament sought control. She wanted structure, order, results, and yet the one arena she had never claimed was her own heart. This realization sparked discomfort, not shame but a poignant clarity. She saw that her peace had been conditional. It required her to remain unseen, unheard, and carefully contained. And in avoiding conflict outwardly, She had been ignoring the inner conflict that had been quietly eroding her. Perhaps what she feared most was not judgment from others, but judgment from herself, the realization that she had allowed her own life to be shaped by habit and fear rather than intention. And yet, as she spoke these truths, I saw a subtle shift, a willingness to notice, to name, and perhaps, in time, to reclaim the voice that had been deferred for decades. As she settled into her chair one afternoon, she began to revisit memories she hadn't touched in years. Quiet images surfaced, evenings spent smoothing over a disagreement with her husband, moments she had refrained from speaking up to avoid rocking the boat, small daily compromises that had seemed inconsequential at the time. And yet, looking back, she saw how each had quietly accumulated, shaping not just her days but her heart. She admitted, almost hesitantly, that she had avoided her own feelings for decades. "I kept telling myself it was for everyone else's good," she said. "But I'm starting to see that it was also easier than facing my own fear of being wrong or being disliked." Her voice was soft, but the weight of years of avoidance was clear. Each memory carried a subtle ache, regret for what she hadn't said, guilt for the time she had allowed others' comfort to override her own, and a quiet longing for acknowledgement she hadn't demanded. As we opened the scriptures together, she noticed something remarkable in Proverbs 5. "Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth." It wasn't about judgment or punishment. It was about attention to herself, to her own life, to the love and care she could nurture from her own well. The call to wisdom, she realized, was more about governing herself than criticizing others. Each past decision she regretted now became a point of awareness, a chance to see where she had strayed from honoring her own needs. Her internal dialogue shifted in subtle ways. She admitted the guilt she had carried, naming it aloud. The guilt of saying no, the guilt of wanting space, the guilt of longing for recognition. And yet, beneath that guilt, there was a seed of clarity, awareness that she had the capacity to choose differently, even now. She began to see that regret, when noticed carefully, was not condemnation. It was a guidepost. She paused, fingers tracing the edge of her Bible, and smiled faintly. "I think I've been trying to live life as if my voice didn't matter," she said. "But maybe it does. Maybe I've been underestimating the blessing of what I already have, and the life I can still shape." By the end of that session, she was quiet but alert, not burdened by emotion but attentive to it. She had begun to untangle decades of avoidance, regret, and subtle guilt. Each memory, each reflection became a step toward recognizing the patterns she had inherited, and the patterns she could now choose to leave behind. One afternoon, as she folded the laundry with her usual precision, something shifted in her attention. For the first time, she noticed how habit had guided her for years. The automatic ways she deferred, remained silent, and carried the weight of others' comfort above her own. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a quiet clarity that settled like a light on a familiar room. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "I see now that fear has been louder than truth, my own truth." She didn't feel brave in some dramatic sense, she felt aware. She recognized how often she had allowed avoidance to dictate her actions, the unspoken words at dinner, the suppressed opinions in conversations with her children, the small, habitual concessions that had accumulated into a life half-lived. This recognition was behavioral, not abstract. She noticed how her shoulders stiffened whenever she sensed potential conflict, how she held back in meetings, how she arranged her day around others' comfort. Seeing it was enough to start making conscious choices. She could pause before reacting, speak when it mattered, honor her needs without guilt. The steps would be small, careful, deliberate. She didn't declare a new life or promise instant change. Instead, she acknowledged what she could do differently in the moment. She chose a simple action first. When her husband asked for her opinion on a small household decision, she gave it honestly, calmly, without over-explaining or retreating. It was modest, yet it carried the weight of decades of silence. As we reflected, she smiled faintly, a trace of satisfaction in her eyes. "It feels respectful," she said. "Not just to others but to myself." That was the essence of her turning point, quiet, clear, anchored in behavior. She hadn't conquered fear or erased decades of habit, but she had glimpsed the dignity of choosing differently, moment by moment. Perhaps this is the way transformation begins for many of us. Not in grand gestures, but in small, mindful steps that honor truth over habit, voice over silence, and self-respect over automatic concession. A week later, she returned with a quiet determination that was different from the subtle tension she had carried before. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden flood of emotion, but a steady shift in how she moved through her day. She described a moment the night before at dinner. Her husband had suggested a plan she didn't fully agree with, and for the first time in years she paused. Instead of nodding automatically, she looked at him and said calmly, "I understand your idea, but here's what I think might work better." She didn't raise her voice, argue, or retreat. She simply stated her perspective and waited. It was a small choice, yet it carried weight. She noticed the respect in his response, the pause that acknowledged her words. And more importantly, she felt a quiet affirmation inside herself. She had ended a cycle of silent compliance that had long dictated her life, replacing it with deliberate action that preserved both dignity and harmony. Later that afternoon, she called a friend to clarify a long-standing boundary she had avoided addressing. The conversation was measured, firm, and kind. No defensiveness, no over-apologizing. Just a clear expression of what she would and would not accept moving forward. She told me with a smile that it felt strangely freeing, like reclaiming a small piece of herself that had been ceded to habit and fear for decades. Even in mundane moments, she began to notice subtle choices, declining tasks that weren't hers to carry, expressing her opinion in meetings, or gently redirecting her children when old patterns of automatic caregiving threatened to overwhelm her. These were not dramatic victories. There were no fireworks, no instant perfection, but each choice reinforced a new rhythm: awareness, clarity, and intentional action. Perhaps this is the essence of transformation. Not a single breakthrough, but repeated, respectful choices that honor both oneself and others. She had learned that change begins with small, concrete actions. A gentle word spoken, a boundary set, a long-held silence ended, and that these steps, multiplied over time, carry far more weight than any fleeting emotion. As she stood to leave that afternoon, there was a subtle lightness in her step, a quiet confidence in the way she held herself. She hadn't transformed overnight, nor had she erased decades of habit, but she had made a clear choice, one that was visible in how she carried herself, in how she spoke, in the small boundaries she had begun to honor. I watched her settle a small disagreement at home with calm clarity, speak her perspective without apology, and carry out her responsibilities with intentionality rather than automatic compliance. These were not dramatic gestures, but concrete actions that reflected a shift she had worked to claim for herself. She smiled gently, and I sensed the relief of someone finally recognizing that change does not require perfection. Only attention, awareness, and deliberate steps forward. She had begun to reclaim her own voice, her own agency, her own dignity. And in doing so, she had found a rhythm that allowed both herself and those around her to breathe more freely. Perhaps this is what Proverbs calls wisdom in action. Not a flawless life, but a heart attentive to truth, a life guided by careful choice, and a commitment to honor what has been entrusted to us. As she left, I whispered a thought I often share. It's never too late to begin again. And for anyone listening, perhaps that quiet encouragement is enough. A reminder that even small, deliberate steps toward awareness, respect, and intentional living can shape a life fully, gently, and with dignity. I wonder, as you listen to her story, what you notice most about the choice she made. Did it feel familiar, a decision you might have faced in your own life? Perhaps there are moments when you found yourself holding back, staying silent, or carefully smoothing over tensions in order to keep the peace. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the way she chose to act differently? Would you have done the same in her place, or would your response have been different? If a situation like this has ever touched your life, feel free to share. Not in a rush or out of drama, but thoughtfully, in a way that honors your experience. Sometimes, noticing the patterns in our own hearts is the first step toward gentle clarity and meaningful change.